Hello, Dragonfly Swarm. Yoimiya is a very abstract character, especially when it comes to building her, so knowing when, where, and why you should use certain gear is imperative to maximizing her potential and landing flashy, destructive firework chaos onto your enemies. Because I'm inclined to say that while she isn't by any means one of the strongest units in the game, she is definitely not weak. And with proper usage, she can rain down fiery firework chaos and very comfortably clear the game's hardest content. And since we've learned and have been given access to new ways of playing and building her since her original banner, it felt criminal not to make an updated 2.8 Yoimiya guide explaining exactly how you can optimize your Yoimiya no matter the situation. So in this video, I'll go over everything I possibly can about Yoimiya's very misunderstood kit, her constellations, her best artifacts, weapons, and teams, and I'll do it with style, because that's what Sino would want. This is a Yoimiya guide though, so I can't give Sino screen time. Yet. You already know the drill. Let's start by looking at Yoimiya's kit, and more specifically her attack talent, which is the core puzzle piece of her very high damage potential. Yoimiya's normal attack sequence is a very fast 5-hit combo in which the 3rd and 5th hits deal absurdly high raw damage, and although her charged attacks, including the added firework thingies, are useless, they are very pretty and festive. As one of the only dedicated normal attack based bow users in the game, Yoimiya has the luxury of benefiting quite nicely from otherwise niche buffs such as attack speed boosts, because she doesn't suffer from the same hit lag interactions that melee users suffer from, which by extension restricts them from making the most of attack speed buffs. And as I said earlier, it's the 3rd and 5th strikes in her normal attack sequence that hit like trucks, so there's quite a big emphasis on getting those attacks out, which means she doesn't inherently have any fancy attack cancels or combos to adhere to. She just has to be able to zone out and left click. And without any attack speed buffs, Yoimiya can perform exactly 3 full normal attack sequences within the duration of her 10-second elemental skill. This elemental skill will simply infuse her attacks with pyro and multiply her normal attack damage by a certain percentage, allowing her to dish out her notoriously high raw single target pyro damage for that whole 10-second duration. However, unlike most damage percent buffs, this one doesn't count as an external one, which basically just means that, for example, Yun Jin's buff won't benefit from this bonus. Not that big of a deal, there's just some extra information. But more importantly, we need to discuss Yoimiya's ICD. As a pyro unit, Yoimiya does benefit from vape teams, but in a kind of weird way. Long story short, Yoimiya's ICD allows her to perfectly vape the 1st, 3rd, and 5th strikes in her attack sequence, which, as I've said, those are her strongest hits. So while she can't vape all of her pyro damage like Hu Tao or Xiangling can, with proper interruption resistance and hydro application, she will constantly vape those attacks, significantly benefiting her personal damage. And as for her elemental burst, it is deceptively useful, and I'm kinda surprised at how many people don't understand its importance to Yoimiya's kit. So her elemental burst causes Yoimiya to launch an AoE pyro explosion onto nearby enemies, which then applies a blaze tag to one of the enemy's hit, lingering for 10 seconds at C0. Every time one of Yoimiya's teammates damages the afflicted enemy, the tag will explode with AoE pyro damage, which can happen once every 2 seconds. And that's all this ability does on its own, but with Yoimiya's 4th Ascension passive, casting the ability will grant Yoimiya's team a 10% attack buff for 15 seconds, which can potentially become a 20% attack buff when you consider her 1st Ascension passive. This is because her 1st Ascension passive will not only grant her a 2% pyro damage bonus every time she hits enemies with normal attacks during her elemental skill, for up to a 20% bonus total, but each stack of this pyro damage bonus she has will also grant 1% more attack to the buff her 4th Ascension passive provides to her teammates. And this all ties into her burst because it allows her to pair exceptionally well with units like Xingqiu Official and Beidou, who all have substantial off-field damage that will benefit from this attack buff. Therefore, there's a huge importance to this burst in many of Yoimiya's best teams, and using it properly at the right times, plus building accordingly with the burst in mind, will usually be the difference between a powerful Yoimiya team damage output and a mediocre one. Keep in mind too that with that side-by-side showcase, I was only using a very basic team setup to show the benefit of using the burst. There are other teams that will benefit from Yoimiya's buff even more than this one, making it that much more important to not completely ignore her burst. Little bit of a side note, a handful of Yoimiya's best gear will force her to change when she casts her burst for its best uptime, so I'll explain that anytime we discuss a weapon or an artifact set that does this. Her burst does not snapshot, meaning it can benefit from buffs while it's on the field, but it can also lose them. It also has standard ICD, and as I kind kinda brushed over earlier with its 2-second cooldown per blaze tag explosion, this makes it so that the burst can only trigger reactions every other hit, which is kinda sad, but luckily direct damage isn't the only value it provides anyways. So, with all this in mind, you'll usually want to cast Yoimiya's burst sometime before she casts her skill, whether that means at the very beginning of the rotation or just before she actually takes her field time. Then using her skill to enhance her normal attacks, you just spam her sequence 3 times while passively collecting the A1 pyro damage bonus and the A4 attack bonus for Yoimiya's teammates. Obviously there's more to it than that depending on your teams, but those are the fundamentals of her playstyle. And finally, as for her talent leveling priority, you'll want to level up her normal attacks first and foremost, then I'd say between her burst and her skill, it's almost more valuable to invest in them equally. And I say this because Yoimiya's skill already starts out with a high scaling, and that scaling doesn't increase by very much per level. So most people will say to prioritize the skill over the burst, but honestly, it really just depends on her teams, because in some teams her burst will have significantly more influence than in other teams. So I'd say it's fair to level them equally if you're not strictly confining yourself to one specific Yoimiya team. Moving onwards to Constellations, luckily for Yoimiya Wanters, you don't need Constellations for her to be enjoyable. And in fact, most of her Constellations are kind of mediocre anyways, but I will still explain them and value them because pee poo poo. Yoimiya's C1 is good in theory, bad in practice, because this Constellation won't mean anything to her against bosses apart from the extra 2 procs of her burst with the extended duration. In multi-target, Yoimiya will quite enjoy the 20% attack bonus from killing marked enemies, but even then, it's a conditional buff, one that's especially hard to work around in some instances given Yoimiya's auto-targeting. So again, in theory, it's not a bad constellation, but its biggest problem is that it is quite conditional. At C2 though, Yoimiya will now enjoy a 25% pyro damage bonus for 6 seconds anytime her pyro damage critically strikes enemies, and this does include her burst even if she's off the field. So this is basically just a permanent straight up 25% pyro damage bonus given how easy it is for Yoimiya to maintain, and that makes this one of the more reasonable constellations to shoot for if you really want constellations on Yoimiya. C3 adds 3 levels to her skill, which isn't worth it to put it bluntly. As I've said, Yoimiya's skill doesn't scale very well with levels, so this constellation won't be a significant damage bonus at all. And next up is C4, and C4 is also really weird. This is not going well for constellation wanters. C4 basically allows her to speed up her rotations by shortening the cooldowns of her skill every time her blaze tag explodes, but the problem with this is that there are very few teams in which Yoimiya can actually take advantage of this. Most of her best teams are locked into rotations that are simply just too long to fit in this constellation's effects. And while I would argue Mono Pyro might be a different story since you can technically just go ham and spam stuff, that's about the only team that would notably benefit from this constellation. C5 adds 3 levels to Yoimiya's burst, which admittedly can be as valuable as the 3 extra levels to her skill, but that's not saying much at all, and it would require her to have her burst up constantly off cooldown, which just isn't possible for some of her teams in gear. So generally, it's also a very much not worthwhile constellation. And finally, C6. So C6 is a good constellation, and it does quite significantly increase Yoimiya's damage output, but the value of that increase will depend on the team she's in. Basically, with C6, Yoimiya's vape teams are pretty much gacha simulator now because there's literally no telling which of her attacks will be vaped, which kind of ruins the point of even slotting her into vape teams because of her functionality with it. But even then, it's still a significant damage increase because of the sheer amount of extra damage that she'll be dealing with C6's arrows. So while vape teams become slightly less enticing because of their functionality with this constellation, in general, she will see a significant damage increase in all of her teams because of this constellation. But yeah, overall, Yoimiya's most valuable constellations are C2 and C6, while C1 is situationally good and C3 through C5 are generally just not worth it. And so we must move on to the artifact discussion, and weirdly enough, there is quite a lot to talk about here. Yoimiya's got quite a few potential best in slot sets, and she's also been introduced to a kind of controversial new artifact set, so let's just get the most universally hated one out of the way first. Generally speaking, Yoimiya's highest potential comes with the 4-piece Shimenawa's Reminiscence set, which grants her a nice attack boost, and for a cost of 15 energy upon casting her skill, a huge 50% normal attack damage increase. The problem is that this 15 energy cost quite significantly disrupts her burst uptime, and despite what some players think, as I've said, her burst provides a lot of importance to some of her strongest teams, so this set will either force you to run Yoimiya with powerful battery units or sacrifice some of her offensive substats for energy recharge. For that reason, I really only recommend using this set under a few scenarios and conditions. Number 1, if you plan on playing Yoimiya with strong battery units like Fischl in Overload teams or Bennett in Overvape, Monopyro, or Vape teams. Number 2, if your Yoimiya is in a team where she is the hyper carry and by extension the only damage dealer, such as a double Geo Vape team, because in these teams, no one will really miss the high uptime on the attack bonus from her burst, making it less of an opportunity cost to run Shimenawas. And number 3, if your Yoimiya is or will be at high investment. By this, I mean if she has either or multiple of the following: Thundering Pulse, which is her signature weapon, a C6 Yun Jin, and or C2 Yoimiya. And this is because all three of these things, especially when paired together, work with Yoimiya to significantly increase the value of her normal attacks, making it much less important to focus on her burst uptime anyways, because she herself is making up for a significant portion of the lost damage from her burst and its buff simply with her normal attacks. But overall with Shimenawas, while it is technically and mathematically her best in slot, it can be a pretty big headache to work with if you're not at high investment or using meticulous team building and rotation crafting. Another competitive and far less conditional 4-piece set to run with is the Crimson Witch set, which will grant Yoimiya a nice pyro damage bonus and an enhancement to the damage of her pyro related reactions. This set will not be ideal on your Yoimiya if she's not in teams that heavily focus on reaction damage, so it'll only be competitive with Shimenawas in teams such as Vaporized teams and Overvape teams. But in these teams, it can often become her best in slot by a marginal amount, given that it won't restrict her burst uptime and it will also make up for Shimenawa's high damage with its own high reaction damage bonuses. However, this set will greatly incentivize that you lock Yoimiya's ICD onto her 3rd and 5th normal attacks, as I explained earlier, because these attacks are where her vape damage will benefit the most, and as such, you'll need a good shielder or interruption resistance to make sure Yoimiya's attack sequences are not interrupted at all. Okay, so as for the Echoes of an Offering set, which a lot of my community wanted to know about in regards to how good it is on Yoimiya, my answer is not really. If you've already farmed a good set for Yoimiya, there's not really any reason at all to farm for this set, because although its passive seems pretty good, it's actually quite weird, especially on Yoimiya because of how different the scaling is on each of her attacks. This basically means that you'd be completely randomizing which of Yoimiya's attacks receive the buff damage from the 4-piece bonus, and if it were to theoretically constantly buff Yoimiya's 3rd and 5th hits along with some of the other hits in her string, it would quite significantly outperform her other artifact options. But that's unrealistic. That won't ever happen consistently, and in fact, sometimes the buff might only apply to the weakest hits in her attack sequence, which would cause this set to perform notably worse than her other options. So, in my educated opinion, it's just too inconsistent on Yoimiya to warrant farming for over other sets. And if you were looking towards the Echo set because you don't want to have to manage a set as complicated and headache-inducing as Shimenawa's, I instead introduce to you 4-piece Retracing Bolide. It's basically a far less conditional version of Shimenawa's, and although it provides a 10% lower normal attack damage bonus, it's quite reasonable to maintain a 100% shield uptime on this bonus without the need for crazy complex rotations or energy management. Not to mention, Yoimiya prefers pairing with shielders anyways, as we've discussed. So while no, it's not as good as Shimenawa's or even Crimson Witch in reaction teams, it's not a bad set by any means at all, and if you already have some good pieces lying around, this can be a very comfortable final build for Yoimiya to run with. Yoimiya does have quite a range of other potentially powerful artifacts though, such as 4-piece Lava Walkers, which works amazing in mono pyro teams for the high pyro aura uptime, and this set is quite competitive as her best in slot when used in these mono pyro teams, beating Shimenawa's in situations where you can maintain a high burst uptime. And then obviously you can always opt for a 2-piece combination of either Crimson Witch and an attack set, or 2 attack sets together for a very unconditional setup that allows you to easily farm for the stats that you'll need. If you want to get meticulous about it, the 2-piece Crimson 2-piece attack is generally better than the 2-piece attack 2-piece attack, but it is what it is. Outside of these options though, there aren't many other sets worth mentioning on Yoimiya, and as I said, while Shimenawa's is technically her best in slot across most scenarios, it only really becomes her best in slot if you can either find a way to maintain a decent burst uptime, or heavily invest into Yoimiya's normal attacks to cover and surpass the damage lost from her burst. As for Yoimiya's artifact main stats, it's very straightforward, because you will always want to run a crit circlet in order to balance your crit ratio, a pyro damage goblet, and an attack sands. However, elemental mastery sands can be nearly equal to attack sands in reaction teams with 4-piece Crimson Witch, so if you happen to have better substats on an elemental mastery sands, that can work. And as for substats, you'll usually want to prioritize crit substats first, then attack percent substats, and then finally ER percent and EM substats are generally useful to pick up along the way as well. Energy recharge percent does become more valuable if you're running Shimenawa's, but you have to be careful not to deliberately sacrifice too many of your substat rolls for ER percent over offensive stats, because you will quickly cross the line of losing damage on Yoimiya if you do this. So in general, I prefer to play and recommend running Yoimiya with good battery and buffer units rather than dedicating energy recharge to her burst uptime. Moving on to Yoimiya's wide variety of weapon options, unfortunately the problem with which weapon to run on your Yoimiya is that it will kinda depend on the scenario, and some of her best weapons kinda alter the way you want to play her, so we'll go over that as we discuss each weapon. Starting with Yoimiya's undisputed best in slot, Thundering Pulse. This weapon provides a very high base attack and a very nice crit damage bonus, and this is all accompanied by a 20% attack bonus plus up to a 40% normal attack damage bonus granted by the weapon's passive, all of which luxuries work together to make this Yoimiya's best in slot weapon in pretty much every scenario. The problem is that when you run 4-piece Shimenawas, this weapon's passive becomes significantly harder to work with for maximum normal attack damage stacks, and you'll have to consider using Yoimiya's burst at the very beginning of a rotation rather than right before she hits the field. This is mostly because if you cast her burst right before she casts her skill to deal her damage, she won't gain Shimenawa's 4-piece bonus because of the 15 energy cost, and thus will be locked out of a substantial portion of her damage. However, alternatively, if you try to ignore her burst by simply casting her skill and just forgetting about the burst while it charges back up, Yoimiya will lose the third stack of the Thundering Pulse passive, which, as I will show you in this side-by-side, will also cost her some of her full rotation damage. So yeah, with Thundering Pulse, it is a very fun weapon with most of her builds and teams, but with Shimenawas, it will require you to play a very stressful game of give and take, where you find and perfect a rotation that works for you and your teams, one in which Yoimiya can keep a reasonable uptime on her burst whilst maintaining full Thundering Pulse stacks. But she does have other powerful 5-star weapons such as Skyward Harp, Polar Star, and Aqua Simulacra, all of which fall kind of short of Thundering Pulse, but perform similarly powerful as Yoimiya's second best options. This is mostly because of the very high crit value all of these weapons provide, but they each also have their own gimmicks that make them better for Yoimiya in certain scenarios. For example, Aqua and Polar Star would generally pull ahead of Skyward Harp in teams with Yun Jin and damage percent buffers like Yelan, Kazuha, etc. And this is because of the fact that Yoimiya would technically benefit more from the added external bonuses such as Aqua's very high crit damage bonus and 20% passive damage increase, and Polar Star's similarly high crit value and built-in attack bonuses. But by that same logic, Skyward Harp can easily pull ahead of Aqua Simulacra and maybe even Polar Star in some cases, given Yoimiya can't fully use Polar Star's passive, and because of Skyward Harp's respectable crit value and its extremely high base attack, adding a lot of value to external attack bonuses from Pyro Resonance, Attack Sands, Noblesse, things like that. In general though, you can't really go wrong with any of these three weapons, and though I'd say Polar Star is usually the strongest, though still not as strong as Thundering Pulse, all three of these weapons perform only slightly better or worse than each other in any given scenario. But another one of Yoimiya's best weapons is surprisingly a 4-star weapon, the Rust Bow, and I'm a huge advocate for Rust because it's the weapon I used before I got my hands on Thundering Pulse, and at R5, this weapon is so good on Yoimiya that it can compete with and even straight up outperform some of the aforementioned 5-star weapons. And this is heavily due to the massive normal attack damage bonus and attack this weapon provides, making it extremely valuable when Yoimiya is paired with Yun Jin, but even outside of that, it's easily one of her best weapons and her strongest 4-star weapon at R5. Other weapons such as Amos Bow, Viridescent Hunt, Hamayumi, and Prototype Crescent can substitute my previous recommendations if you haven't been able to get at least 1 or 2 copies of Rust, but after you've reached, I'd say, Rust R3, you'd benefit much more from slotting it instead of these weapons, though they're definitely not bad weapons, and Hamayumi as well as Prototype Crescent are free-to-play craftable weapons with respectable power. Just be sure not to use Hamayumi with Shimenawa's set, they are unfortunately incompatible. And there are other weapons such as the 3-star Slingshot Bow, which at R5 can actually compete with some of Yoimiya's 4-star options, and Blackcliff Warbow, but Blackcliff really isn't worth obtaining or refining just for Yoimiya, it's really expensive. So I'd stick with my other recommendations. But in general and overall with her weapons, Yoimiya's weapon pool is quite versatile, as a lot of her best weapons perform similarly powerfully, plus she has access to R5 Rust, which is an amazing 4-star weapon when she's using it. Absolutely insane. But not as insane as team comping, so let's get into what teams Yoimiya does her best in. So Yoimiya is a very versatile character when it comes to team building for a certain specific reason. She can play as 2 types of main DPS units, those 2 types being a regular carry or a hyper carry. As a regular carry, Yoimiya will rely much more on her burst to help buff powerful off-field teammates such as Beto, Fischl, and Xingqiu, so that they are contributing a similarly impactful amount of damage as Yoimiya herself is. This makes her a fantastic regular carry in over Vape teams with these kinds of attack scaling off-field DPS units because it will grant her a bit of access to AoE damage, as well as allow her to use her fast normal attacks to drive Beto's burst very effectively. And it also warrants the use of other artifact sets such as 4-piece Crimson Witch over Shimenawa's Reminiscence, so you won't have to worry about managing her burst uptime under the difficult circumstances of Shimenawa's 15 energy cost. It's important to note too that in overvape teams you can quite comfortably flex your team spots. Yun Jin can substitute Bennett in this team, Fischl could replace Beto to turn it into a more high damage single target team, and or Xingqiu could be replaced by Yelan for a similarly high hydro application and a very high damage percent buff from her burst for even further emphasis on devastating single target damage from this team. Another very fun and very strong team for Yoimiya as a regular DPS is Pure Pyro, in which you would typically pair Yoimiya with Bennett, Kazuha/C6 Zuko/Venti, and then another buffer such as Xiangling or Yun Jin. With this team, Yoimiya can kinda lean more towards a hyper carry if Yun Jin is in your last slot, and more towards a regular carry if Xiangling is in the last slot. But the general goal of the team is simply to dish out ridiculously high raw pyro damage. With 4-piece Lava Walkers, this team will allow Yoimiya to constantly benefit from a 35% damage increase, and she'll be able to help teammates like Xiangling and Kazuha deal their own very respectable damage because of her burst buff. But she can still use 4-piece Shimenawas quite comfortably in this team, especially if you're running Yun Jin rather than Xiangling. And the team itself is very simple to execute with good energy circulation, so in general, I'd say this is one of Yoimiya's strongest and most enjoyable team comps. As for Yoimiya's more hyper carry favored team, yes, she can slot into Vape teams, and there's quite a bit to understand about Yoimiya Vape teams that make them different from other Vape teams. In general, you'll need Yoimiya, a Hydro unit, and a Shielder. You're really gonna need to have a Shielder in this team if you're not running Xingqiu, and you should run one even with Xingqiu because, as I mentioned in the beginning of this guide, Yoimiya has to be able to Vape her 3rd and 5th normal attacks every time they land, and the only way to do that is to not be interrupted midway through her attack sequence. So the strongest way to build this team is to pair Yoimiya with a strong Hydro applicator such as Xingqiu or Yelan, a shielder such as Diona or Zhongli, and a buffer who should always be either Bennett or Yun Jin, with Yun Jin coming out on top as Yoimiya's best buffer in this team style. This team provides Yoimiya with all the shielding and hydro applications she's gonna need, plus as I said, Yun Jin at high investment is a stronger buffer for Yoimiya than Bennett. If you don't believe me or you need an explanation, I will link that video below. And in general, with any iteration of Yoimiya's Vape teams, the goal is simply to set up a team where Yoimiya and her Vape normal attacks are being heavily buffed to deal some of the highest single target damage in the game. This means she's gonna benefit much more from playing as a hyper carry where her gear and her teammates are specifically built to buff her damage and her damage only. Thus, weapons such as Thundering Pulse and R5 Rust plus Shimenawas will be a fantastic pair for Yoimiya when she's with Yun Jin in this team because of the way their kits work together and because of the fact that Yoimiya's own absurdly high damage output will more than make up for the lost damage from not having her burst up consistently. And anyways, her team won't really need the burst buff in general because they're all there to buff Yoimiya. The problem with this team though is that it's generally only at its absolute strongest when you've got Yoimiya and or her teammates at high investment, and the team itself is almost always exclusively single target, so even with some of the highest single target damage in the game, it will pale in comparison to other less expensive teams in horde floors and other multi-target scenarios. However, against DPS checks, smaller groups of stronger enemies in Spiral Abyss, and bosses, this team absolutely shreds. Other teams for Yoimiya include a full overload team with Fischl and Beto to make great use of Yoimiya's burst buff and her great driving capabilities, and also a weird but very strong and quite cheap variant of the Vape team setup in which you use Thoma, Xingqiu, and Sucrose to help Yoimiya hypercarry her team with Vape attacks. The team has a very difficult rotation strategy which I explained in my Thoma guide if you want to check that out, but it basically allows Yoimiya to comfortably run with Thoma as an enabler for shielding and Viridescent Shred so that she can dish out a similar amount of damage as she can in the more expensive versions of her Vape teams. But that just about sums up my guide on the coolest firework in the game. Overall, though she's not one of the strongest DPS units in the game, Yoimiya has the luxury of being very easy to build and play, and still yet be very powerful and flexible because of her kit. And since she's gained so many new strategies and teammate accessibility options since her release, I cannot wait to see what lies in store for her at Sumeru's release. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video or it helped you in any way, please leave a like and consider subscribing because it really helps the channel. Also, you should totally join my Discord server because I would love to see you around in my community and say hello to you. But until then, I'm gonna sit here and wait for Sino to become a playable character so that I can main him. Will he ever become playable? Who knows? But he better.